All right, so today we're diving deep into India's economy and specifically their oil situation. A lot of people are thinking, hey, oil prices are going down globally. That's got to be great for India, right?
Right.
I mean, they import most of their oil, so cheaper oil equals happy times. Well, we found this article in the Indian Express that's going to make us all rethink that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation because on the surface, it does seem positive, right? But when you look closer, you realize things are a little more complicated than that.
Okay, so first, just a level set for everyone, India gets like 88.1% of its oil from other countries. So, yeah, they're very vulnerable to any price swings in the global market.
It's kind of like imagine India's economy is a huge train, right? And oil is the fuel that keeps it going. Any disruptions or price spikes, it can really throw the whole system off.
Okay, so global prices went down this year from $91 a barrel in April down to $71 in November. You'd think India would be pretty happy about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think so, right? Cheaper fuel means lower costs for businesses, less strain on their finances, and it should give their economy a boost.
But, and here's where things get really interesting, their oil import bill, meaning how much they're spending on oil overall, only shrunk by about 9% in the fall. Even with those lower prices, that's kind of weird, right?
Yeah, and the reason for that is that even though the price per barrel went down, India actually increased how much oil they're buying. We're talking like a 4.4% jump in how much they're importing.
So they're buying more, even though it's cheaper. Why would they do that? Are they stocking up like when there's a sale at the grocery store?
Well, it's not really about stocking up. It's tied to their economy. Their economy is doing really well right now, growing really fast, and all that activity needs more energy to keep it going.
Oh, okay. So more cars on the road, more factories running, more of everything, all needing fuel to run.
Exactly, and this is where it gets kind of tricky because this increase in demand is actually kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yeah, it's a sign that their economy is doing well, which is great. But on the other hand, it makes them even more vulnerable to those global oil price swings we were talking about.
So this good news about oil prices being lower isn't really that straightforward.
No, it's definitely not a simple situation. And this is where that table in the article we talked about, growing divergence, really helps show what's happening.
Yeah, it breaks things down month by month, and it's pretty interesting. Like in October, even though their import bill dropped almost 11%, they were still buying more than 4% more oil than the previous year. So that demand is clearly there.
Right, and you can see that same trend for September and November too. India's need for oil is increasing even though globally things are slowing down.
Which makes me wonder, why are global prices dropping? I mean, is it just because everyone else isn't using as much as India?
Well, there are a few things happening. One is that demand from China has slowed down a bit, and they're usually a huge oil consumer.
So less demand means lower prices. Makes sense.
Exactly. And then there's the US dollar, which has been getting stronger lately. And since oil is traded in US dollars, that makes it more expensive for countries who use other currencies.
Oh, okay. So a strong dollar is like an invisible price hike for anyone not using dollars.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then on top of that, you have all the general uncertainty in the global economy right now. When things are uncertain, people and businesses tend to spend less, and that includes spending on things like oil.
So less demand from China, a strong dollar making it more expensive, plus global economic worries. It's kind of like the perfect storm pushing prices down.
Yeah, I mean, if it was just about global factors, this would be fantastic news for India. But as we're seeing, their own demand for oil is going against that trend.
So it's this weird paradox. Lower prices should be good for them, but they need to import more and more to keep their economy going, which makes their future a little uncertain, at least when it comes to oil.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bigger picture of how this is all going to play out and why it matters not just for India, but for everyone.
And we'll dive into that right after the break. So we've got this kind of like weird situation, right? Lower global oil prices are good news for India, at least in theory. But they're importing more and more to keep up with their booming economy. And that makes things kind of unpredictable for them.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to build something really solid, but the ground underneath is shaky.
And that brings us to the bigger picture, right? This isn't just about what's happening in India. This whole oil situation, it has the potential to really impact the global energy market. And that's something all of us as, global citizens should be aware of.
For sure. Think about it like this. If India keeps buying more and more oil, even as other countries try to cut back, what's going to happen?
Well, it seems like they could end up pushing those global prices back up, even if everything else is pointing down.
Exactly. It's like everyone else is easing off the gas pedal and India's foot is still slammed down and it just throws the whole system off balance.
So let me get this straight. My gas prices could go up because of what's happening with oil in India.
It's not impossible, and it's not just about gas prices either. This also affects India's relationships with those countries that produce oil.
Oh, right. If they're buying more, they have more power in those relationships, right?
Exactly. They become the customer everyone wants to keep happy. But it also brings in a whole other layer of, like, global politics and strategy.
So India needs a more long-term plan here. They can't just keep relying on imports forever, right? I mean, what are their options? Could they find more oil in their own country?
Well, they've been trying to increase their domestic oil production, but it's not really keeping up with their needs.
Oh, so they are finding oil. It's just not enough to meet that crazy demand.
Right. There are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, finding and getting oil out of the ground takes a lot of money and infrastructure. It's not something you can just like flip a switch and suddenly have tons of oil.
And then there's also the environmental impact, right?
Yeah.
Drilling for oil isn't exactly, saving the planet.
Yeah, and then there's the even bigger question of how much oil is even there in the first place. Maybe they just don't have enough to be totally self-sufficient, no matter how hard they try.
So domestic oil production isn't the answer. What about, like, all that renewable energy stuff? I mean, India's got tons of sun. Couldn't they just power the whole country with solar panels?
Well, that's definitely the goal for a lot of people, and they're making progress. They've been investing a lot in solar power, and it's starting to make a difference.
But it's got to be tough to, like, switch a whole country over to solar, right?
Oh, yeah. It's a huge project. You got to build all the infrastructure, like the panels and the systems, to get that energy where it needs to go. And you got to figure out how to store it for when it's not sunny. Plus, you have to manage all of that while keeping the existing power grid running.
It's like trying to change a tire while you're driving down the highway.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it's tough, but not impossible. But in the meantime, India still has to deal with this dependence on imported oil.
So what can they do right now, like in the short term? I mean, if you're going to rely on someone else for something as important as oil, it seems like having options would be a good idea.
Right, exactly. That's where the idea of diversifying their oil sources comes in. If they rely too much on just one or two countries, that can be a problem, especially with all the, geopolitical uncertainty in the world right now.
So spreading the risk,
Yeah.
having different suppliers, having a plan B, that's the smart play.
Exactly. It gives them more flexibility and power in negotiations. And if one supplier, like, has problems or gets unreliable, they've got other options.
Makes sense. Are there any other things they can do? What about just, like, using the oil they do have more efficiently?
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. It might not be as, exciting as building giant solar farms, but it makes a huge difference.
So basically getting more bang for their buck with every barrel of oil, how does that work?
Well, one way is to have stricter rules about how fuel-efficient cars and trucks have to be. If every vehicle on the road in India got better gas mileage, that would be a huge reduction in how much oil they need.
And what about buildings? I know there's a lot of talk about making buildings more energy efficient.
Absolutely. If you design new buildings to use less energy and update older buildings, that can significantly reduce how much energy they use for things like heating and cooling.
And then there's public transportation, right? Getting more people on buses and trains instead of driving their own cars.
You got that. All of those things can make a big impact. But here's the thing. A lot of these solutions require people to change their behavior.
So it's not just about new technology. It's about changing habits and mindsets.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where people are thinking about how much energy they use and making choices that are more sustainable.
It sounds like a pretty big challenge.
It is, but it's also a challenge that could really bring people together. I mean, everyone benefits from a more stable and sustainable energy future.
So we've talked about what India can do, but let's circle back to those global implications for a second. We talked about how their demand for oil could push up prices, but how does that affect those countries that are actually trying to reduce how much oil they use?
That's a really interesting question because it creates this sort of tension. Like, imagine a country like Germany that's investing heavily in wind and solar power to move away from oil. But then oil prices start going up again because of India's demand.
It would make all those efforts way more difficult.
For sure, and a lot more expensive too. It shows how connected everything is in the global energy market. What one country does can have ripple effects on everyone else, even if they have different goals.
It's like a tug of war where everyone's pulling in different directions.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And it makes you wonder, Can we even work together on this global energy problem when everyone has such different needs?
Right. It seems like what India needs right now is almost the opposite of what's good for the planet in the long term.
It's a tough situation, for sure. And it's going to take a lot of careful planning, diplomacy, and cooperation to find a way forward that works for everyone.
Well, it's definitely something to think about, and we'll keep exploring this after the break. We've been talking a lot about oil, like it's just numbers and charts and stuff. But it's important to remember that this is really affecting people's lives. All the stuff we're talking about, it has real consequences for real people.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, but at the end of the day, energy policy is about people. It's about how they live, how they work, their health, everything.
So let's talk about that for a minute. How does India relying so much on imported oil actually affect people in India, like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, one of the most direct impacts is on their wallets. As India needs more and more oil, it pushes up prices globally, and those higher prices end up hitting consumers.
So that means more expensive gas, more expensive groceries, pretty much everything costs more.
Exactly, and that can be really tough for families who are already struggling to make ends meet. They have to choose between, like, putting food on the table or filling up their gas tank.
Yeah, it becomes about basic survival at that point.
And it's not just about gas prices either. Higher energy costs affect everything. Businesses have to pay more to ship things, so they raise prices, and that just leads to more inflation, and it can even cause social unrest.
So it's this whole chain reaction that just makes things worse, especially for people who are already struggling.
Right. And then there's the environmental impact, too. More oil means more pollution, which is a huge problem in cities in India.
Yeah, we all know how bad air pollution is for people's health. It can cause breathing problems, heart problems, even cancer.
Exactly. And it's often the most vulnerable people who suffer the most, like older people, kids, people with health conditions.
So this isn't just some abstract economic issue. It's about real people's lives and well-being.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to talk about this and to think about the human side of these policies.
Okay, so we've talked about how it affects people in India, but we've also established that this is a global issue. So how does this affect people in other countries, even those who are trying to use less oil?
Well, we touched on the impact on global oil prices. Basically, India needing more oil can push those prices up for everyone, even if other countries are cutting back.
So it's like they're making it harder for other countries to move away from oil.
Yeah, and that can cause a lot of tension internationally. You have countries trying to do the right thing, trying to switch to cleaner energy, but they're being held back by what's happening elsewhere.
It's almost like they're taking 2 steps forward and then getting pushed 1 step back.
Exactly, and it highlights the need for countries to work together on this. We can't solve this problem if everyone's just doing their own thing.
So besides prices, are there any other ways that India needing more oil could affect people around the world?
Well, there's also the geopolitical aspect. As India needs more and more oil, they're going to need to find reliable suppliers and build strong relationships with those countries.
Which could make those oil-producing countries more powerful on the world stage.
Exactly, and those shifts in power can have all sorts of unpredictable consequences.
It's like a big, complicated game of chess with very high stakes.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Okay, so we talked about a lot of challenges and potential problems, but is there any reason for optimism? Is there any hope that things can get better?
I think there's definitely hope, like we talked about before. India has options. They can invest more in renewable energy, find more diverse sources of oil, and use the oil they have more efficiently.
So it's not a hopeless situation. They have tools they can use to create a more sustainable future.
Exactly. It'll take work and commitment, but it's definitely possible.
Well, that's good to hear. I think we all need a little dose of optimism these days.
I agree, and I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in this. It's not just about what governments and big companies do, it's about the choices we make in our own lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into India's oil situation, I want to leave everyone with this thought. We've seen how complicated and interconnected this all is. So what can we each do to create a more sustainable and equitable energy future? What changes can we make in our own lives, in our communities, and in the world?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that we all need to be asking ourselves. Thanks for having me on. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this deep dive insightful, and we'll see you next time.